Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thank you so much for joining me for this second session as we study out the Eshel table. And we're really going to jump in today as we talk about Jesus' heart for hospitality. If you haven't had a chance to yet, I encourage you to go ahead and read the introduction section with your group. And then as well, have someone go ahead and read the scripture reading for today as we look at the story of the Good Samaritan. Specifically kind of sets the story as we'll pull out some principles from that. We'll look at an overview of multiple different scenarios and vignettes of Jesus' ministry and how he really approached hospitality. One of the big questions we're going to answer in this session is that of how do I be hospitable if I don't have a home? Jesus didn't have a home, and Jesus didn't have a place that was well decorated, a place that was homey, and yet he was extremely hospitable. So how does that work? Today we're going to take away a lot of those excuses that we have sometimes of I don't have a place that I feel like I'm proud of or that I can invite people into. As you look in your study guides on page 39, we're going to go ahead and jump in here and see that Jesus, he has this incredible heart for hospitality. We're going to look at some of the big ideas here. The first, the big idea we're going to jump into is that Jesus turned ordinary interactions into extraordinary moments through the power of hospitality. So he was able to take these ordinary scenarios and your home, the meals you make, the interactions you have with people can become extraordinary from just these ordinary moments. We're going to really jump in and see how that happens. As we talk about Jesus' heart for ministry, we want to see the approaches that Jesus had to ministry. And this is really amazing. If you've been around church for any length of time, you've probably heard the first two references to how Jesus came to minister. But it's really amazing in the third way that Jesus came to minister, as we'll look at in a moment, that really makes this connection for us to hospitality. So as you look in your study guides there, we see this. How was hospitality a key to Jesus' ministry? First of all, number one, Jesus came to seek and save. Jesus came to seek and save. Luke 19:20 says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save those who are lost." One of the things that I find, even as I had a conversation with a friend recently, a pastor, he had made this comment and said that reaching people who are not churched, people who are not going to church, people who are not of faith, he sees the opportunity there to develop trust through hospitality. And he finds that as we continue down this path, especially in our culture and our society, that a lot of people distrust God, they distrust the church, they distrust each other, they distrust us. And so how do we build trust? And we'll talk about those keys of building and developing trust. But the first way is to be able to be hospitable. We'll see, secondly, Jesus' ministry is he came to serve. Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, Jesus came to serve. We see Matthew writes this, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life a ransom for many." That's really our theme verse for this session. That Jesus, as he's leading and teaching the disciples, he says, you've seen the rulers and the leaders, both of the Romans and the Greeks and the Gentiles. You've seen the Jewish rulers, how they really, their philosophy of life is other people exist to serve me. And he said, that's not how it's gonna happen amongst you. If you want to be the greatest, if you want to be the leader, you have to be willing to be the servant. Then we go to the third way that Jesus came ministering, and this is pretty amazing. Jesus came eating and drinking. The first two aspects of Eshel, of food and water, food and drinking. We see in Luke chapter 7, verse 34, that this is not a commentary that the disciples had of Jesus. This is not even a commentary that Jesus said of himself, as in like an editorial, but this is what the Pharisees, what they saw of Jesus' ministry. These were the ones, and this is what they said. "The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners." So their view of Jesus' ministry was that he spent time with people who were nothing like him, but they enjoyed being around him. And so what's amazing is this, the opportunity for us to show hospitality is really a bridge to help people who may not think like us, may not be like you and I, may not look like you and I. They may be far from God, but we can use opportunity to share a meal with them, have something to drink with them, have an engaging, relaxed conversation in a comfortable setting with them. that can develop the trust to ultimately help them put their trust into Jesus. As you see there in your notes, Jesus had no home, yet he cultivated a culture and community of hospitality. So how did he do that? How did Jesus make that happen? Well, let's look at several ways, and we'll look at some key stories, and we'll bring in here the Good Samaritan story here in a moment. But we'll look and we'll see this, that you can show anyone hospitality even without a home. So how can you do that even without a home? First of all, Jesus fed people. Jesus, he was able to go ahead and throw a party just about anywhere. Jesus fed people. As you see in your notes there, feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. In both of those situations, these are two distinct stories from Matthew and then chapter 14 and then Matthew chapter 15. So Jesus did this twice. He was a repeat offender, if you will. The story goes that Jesus was out speaking in a remote area, and people, thousands of people came. They flocked to hear him speak. And as they were wrapping up his talks, the disciples come and say, Jesus, we need to send these people home. It's getting late in the day. And Jesus says, listen, don't send them away. We need to feed them. And they say, well, Jesus, there's not enough money here between all of us to go ahead and feed this many people. We can't go into town and to be able to buy enough food. And so Jesus says, well, what do you have? And so they bring a couple loaves of bread and a couple fish, and that's where Jesus performs the miracle and feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000 with plenty left over in both circumstances. And so one of the encouragements we can take away is this, is we say, well, I don't have maybe a lot of money, or I'm not really a good cook, or I'm not really good at preparing food. That's okay. Jesus simply used what he had, and he was able to share what he had the best he could. And in this instance, now Jesus performed a miracle, and you and I, we may not be able to perform a miracle, but you'll be amazed as you invite people into your space, as you even go out into other spaces and invite people just to gather and share what you have, how that opens up an opportunity to connect. We'll see that secondly, Jesus met with people. He focused on people. So we see that he had this massive himself, 1 to thousands of people, but then we'll see this, that he had many one-on-one interactions. In John chapter 3, Jesus had a one-on-one interaction with a man named Nicodemus, who had a nighttime engagement meeting. Now, we don't know that they had any food together. It doesn't say that in the context of John 3, 1 through 2, but he came and he interacted with him. We have the woman at the well. Jesus asked her for a drink of water. He didn't offer her something to drink, but he asked her to go ahead and give him something to drink. It's amazing because sometimes in our mindset, depending on how you grew up, or you don't ever ask somebody else for a favor. You are always the one doing the favor. But it's amazing to think about, well, when's the last time you went in and asked your neighbor, hey, do you have some flour or an egg or some butter? I ran out. Now, that's the age-old thing that people used to do that, but who does that anymore? But it's an opportunity for engagement. We see with the woman at the well, Jesus, as he talks to her, she hears this story and she comes around and she puts her faith and trust and she believes, if you will, and she runs off to go into town and tell the other people about it. And the disciples, well, they come back with food. And it's interesting to note here, they say, Jesus, well, what are you doing? Why are you so, lively? Why do you seem like you're so energized? And Jesus says that, they say, did somebody already come feed you? And they're upset because they want to take care of Jesus. And Jesus says, no, I just had this great conversation with this woman. Well, did she feed you? He says, no. And this is interesting, where Jesus says that my meat or my food is to do the will of him that sent me. And so we find, again, there's this understanding. It's one thing to eat physical food, but it's another thing to go ahead and share and make this connection. And that is meaningful. That's what matters. That's fulfilling. We see Jesus also celebrated hospitable people. Jesus celebrated hospitable people. Our passage of scripture that we started with was the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, if you remember that story, there's a Jewish man who's traveling, a businessman, and he ends up being mugged and robbed and beaten, and he's left for dead. A temple priest comes by, passes right on by. A temple Levite comes and passes right on by. And then a Samaritan, if you will, avowed enemy of the Jews in this story, and for them culturally, the one that they would think that would probably beat the Jew up in the first place, he's the one who stops and offers him hospitality. in a great way, where he takes care of him, binds his wounds, tries to comfort him, offers him something to drink and some food, puts him on his donkey, and then actually takes him to a hotel, if you will, to be able to, an inn, to be able to take care of him. An incredible story of hospitality. We see that Jesus celebrated this and used this as the explanation for when the scribes said, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor. And they say, well, who is my neighbor? This is one of the key story then Jesus follows up with, is the story of the Good Samaritan. Then we have Jesus also, number 4, he prioritized gathering. He made gathering in people's homes a massive priority. Look at these examples for gathering. He gathered with Matthew. As soon as he called Matthew to become his follower and disciple, Matthew opened up his home for them to have a big party. Understandably, Matthew was a tax collector, so he must have had some means, and he had a large enough space and place to go ahead and host a gathering. He invited his friends, and he invited Jesus and the other disciples to come as well. We have Zacchaeus, who is, again, another tax collector, and Jesus sees him up in a tree and says, come on down, I'm going to come to your house today. And it's interesting to note, not that I'm encouraging this, but Jesus many times invites himself into these situations. He asked the woman, give me something to drink. He says to Zacchaeus, we're going to go have a party at your house. And so it's interesting to note, even if you don't have a place, it's okay. You can still gather with people and have hospitality. We see Mary, Martha, and Lazarus multiple times throughout Jesus' ministry. He gathers with them at their home. There's some very pivotal stories that take place in Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' home. And then we see number 5, that Jesus, his most profound teaching happened at a dinner, otherwise known as the Last Supper. The chapters of John chapter 13 through John chapter 16 are all the conversation that Jesus had around a dinner table with his disciples. The most important things that he would teach them over his 3 years of ministry or so happened around that table in an amazing way. As you look in your notes then, as we come to a close, we see this, that Jesus used every opportunity to gather with people. He used every opportunity to gather with people. We see that he mastered the art of gathering to reach the hearts of people. So it's this idea that it's not about the food. It's not about what you have to drink. It's not about how amazing the setting is. Jesus, he sat down on a hillside with thousands of people. Jesus went under the cover of darkness and met in this clandestine meeting with Nicodemus. He sat by a well in the middle of the noonday where nobody else was around. He had a Last Supper with his disciples around their table. Many times Jesus, he sat at other people's tables, but it was what he was able to facilitate in this moment of hospitality. And he was able to gather people together around food with something to drink. And he had this engaging way, this winsome way of conversation to build these bridges and to reach people's hearts. And that is Jesus, truly his heart for hospitality. I'd encourage you to go ahead and do the discussion questions. Take a moment to go ahead and unpack what we've talked about in this session. Spend some time in prayer for each other. Then I also encourage you start to think about what we've been talking about over these last several sessions, about who it would be that you would begin to pray about and think about inviting them into a moment of hospitality, whether it's to your home or maybe out to have a cup of coffee. And then in session 3, we're going to look at hospitality made simple. How exactly do we approach hospitality in a simple and easy way to be able to make extraordinary moments happen out of ordinary hospitality?